Hello and welcome to today's episode brought to you by Holy Reads, the world's first Christian book summary app. With Holy Reads, you can discover more powerful insights and summaries from 1,000 plus Christian books in under 20 minutes, whether you want to read or listen. I'm your host, Michael, and today we're diving into A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis. This book is a deeply moving and painfully honest exploration of grief, faith, and the journey to find hope and understanding after loss. Lewis takes us with him into the valleys of sorrow, doubt, and ultimately, spiritual renewal. His words are raw, often uncomfortable, and always sincere, offering an intimate glimpse into the heart of a man who is both a devoted believer and a grieving husband. C.S. Lewis wrote, "A grief observed in the wake of losing his beloved wife, Joy Davidman." For many who know him as a confident Christian apologist, this book presents an entirely different side of him. Here, we meet a man who is vulnerable, who questions, and who struggles to find peace in the midst of overwhelming sorrow. The book's format as a series of journal entries makes it feel deeply personal, as if we're reading Lewis's private thoughts, his unfiltered reactions to a loss that shook him to his core. Lewis married Joy later in life, and their love story is as unique as it is profound. It was an intense, intellectual, and spiritual connection between two individuals who had both journeyed from atheism to Christianity. Joy was not only Lewis's wife, but his confidant, someone who challenged him intellectually and spiritually. Her death left him questioning everything he once held certain, including his faith and his understanding of God's role in human suffering. In these pages, he doesn't just mourn his wife, he mourns the person he was with her, the life they shared, and the future they dreamed of. One of the first things that strikes readers in A Grief Observed is Lewis's description of the physical and emotional toll of grief. He compares it to fear, saying that grief feels almost like a physical assault, leaving him exhausted and restless. It's as if his entire being is on high alert, unable to find rest or comfort. This description is something many listeners might resonate with. Grief, as Lewis describes it, is not just sadness. It's an all-encompassing experience that affects the mind, body, and soul. He shares the frustration of trying to go about daily life while feeling unsteady, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. Tasks that once seemed simple become monumental, and there's a sense of meaninglessness to it all. In these early stages of grief, Lewis captures the feeling of being trapped in a fog, unable to see a way forward. His words remind us that grief is not something we can simply get over. It's a process, often a slow and painful one, that changes us. Another theme that Lewis explores is the deep sense of isolation that comes with grief. Even though he had friends, family, and colleagues who cared for him, he felt as though there was an invisible wall between him and those who hadn't experienced such a profound loss. He writes about how difficult it was to connect with others, even though he craved their presence. This feeling of disconnection is something many grieving people can relate to. It's as though the pain creates a barrier, one that separates the mourner from the rest of the world. Lewis's struggle to connect extends beyond his relationships with others. It also affects his relationship with God. In his grief, he felt abandoned by God, as though his prayers were met with silence. He questioned why God seemed so distant in his time of need, even though he had always believed in a loving and present God. This spiritual isolation adds another layer of complexity to his grief. For Lewis, the silence of God was perhaps the most painful part of his mourning journey, making him feel utterly alone in his suffering. Lewis's reflections on memory are some of the most poignant in the book. People often try to comfort the bereaved by saying that their loved ones live on in their memories. But for Lewis, this idea felt insufficient, even troubling. He feared that over time, his memory of Joy would fade, reducing her to a shadow of who she really was. Can memories alone truly sustain love? This question haunted him as he wrestled with the possibility that he might eventually lose his connection to the person he loved so deeply. He reflects on how even our memories of those we still see tend to change over time. When we reconnect with an old friend, we often realize that our mental image of them was incomplete, that we had forgotten certain quirks or expressions. This realization made Lewis question his ability to hold on to Joy's memory. He feared that he would lose her, not just in death, but also in his mind, as the vivid memories inevitably faded. This fear compounded his grief, adding another layer of pain to his loss. Lewis also reflects on the well-meaning but ultimately empty phrases people often say to those who are grieving. Phrases like, "she's in a better place," or "everything happens for a reason," are meant to comfort. But for Lewis, they felt hollow. These words didn't address the reality of his pain or the depth of his loss. Instead, they seemed to gloss over his grief, as if his sorrow could be smoothed out by simple phrases. This experience reminds us that true comfort doesn't come from offering easy answers. Instead, it comes from being willing to sit with someone in their suffering without trying to fix it. Lewis suggests that what the grieving often need is not explanations, but empathy, a willingness to share in their sorrow. By being present with someone in their pain, we offer a comfort that words alone cannot provide. As Lewis moves deeper into his grief, he begins to search for meaning in his suffering. He questions his understanding of God, grappling with doubts and frustrations he never anticipated. He admits that he was tempted to view God as a cosmic sadist, a being who delights in human suffering. This was a shocking thought for Lewis, who had spent much of his life defending the idea of a loving and just God. Yet in the depths of his sorrow, he found himself questioning everything he once held dear. Over time, however, Lewis begins to see God in a different light. He starts to understand God as a compassionate surgeon, one who cuts deeply not to harm but to heal. This image of God as a healer who allows suffering for a purpose becomes a source of comfort for Lewis. It doesn't take away his pain, but it helps him see his suffering as part of a larger process, one that could ultimately lead to growth and transformation. For Lewis, the act of questioning itself becomes a form of faith. He realizes that his doubts and struggles are not a sign of weak belief, but an honest search for God in his suffering. In this way, grief becomes a path that ultimately leads him closer to God, not because it provides answers, but because it forces him to trust in something beyond his own understanding. One of the most transformative aspects of Lewis's journey is his evolving understanding of love. As he moves through his grief, he begins to see that bereavement is not the end of his love for Joy. Instead, it is a new phase, one that requires him to love her in a different way. He describes this process as a different step in the dance of marriage, one that teaches him to let go of his need for physical presence while still honoring the love they shared. He reflects on the idea that true love is not bound by time or space. Even though Joy is no longer physically with him, her influence continues to shape his life. This realization leads him to a place of praise, not only for Joy, but for God. By continuing to love Joy, he finds himself drawn closer to the heart of God, discovering that his love for her has deepened his understanding of divine love. In the final stages of his grieving process, Lewis comes to a profound realization. The presence of God, and even the presence of our loved ones, does not depend on our memories. He discovers that his journey through grief is not about getting over Joy or moving on. It's about learning to live with her absence in a way that honors her and draws him closer to God. Lewis compares his journey to a twisting valley where each bend reveals something new. Some days, he feels Joy's presence vividly. Other days, she seems distant. But he realizes that her presence, now with God, is something eternal, something that transcends his own ability to remember every detail. This insight brings him an unexpected peace, a quiet joy that begins to grow in place of his sorrow. In the end, Lewis's grief leads him to a place of worship and gratitude. He finds that he can continue to love joy not as a memory, but as a part of his life with God. This love, he realizes, will carry him forward, even as he learns to live with her absence. In a surprising turn, Lewis discovers that his grief has led him to a place of joy, not a superficial happiness, but a deep, abiding joy rooted in his love for God. He comes to see that praise is not about denying our pain, but about celebrating the lives of those who have shaped us. By praising God, he also honors joy, finding a peace that surpasses understanding. For Lewis, grief becomes not an end, but a transformation. His love for joy is no longer bound by memory, but is woven into his relationship with God. This journey, he realizes, is not about forgetting or moving on, but about living with loss in a way that honors both the love he had and the faith he now holds. Thank you for joining us in exploring the depths of grief, love, and faith through the words of C.S. Lewis. His journey shows us that, while grief may not provide us with simple answers, it can lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves and a greater closeness to God. This podcast was brought to you by Holy Reads, the world's first Christian book summary app. If you enjoyed this episode, download Holy Reads to discover more powerful insights and summaries from 1,000 plus Christian books. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more reflections and book summaries to guide your faith journey. Until next time, may you find peace and hope, even in the darkest valleys.